Call the committee to order, and the committee will come to order. I want to thank our guests and witnesses today. First, let me thank you for your service to your country, and I hope that you will pass on the committee's thanks to the men and women who serve and do the real work, as we say, in the intelligence business. Please pass along our admiration, respect, and support, and great thanks for really what has been a very, very, very good year in the intelligence business for the United States of America and our national security. I also want to thank all of you for, since we started this very hearing last year, the very fact that we have established, I think, a very professional working relationship with the community, and I think that has netted very valuable results for our national security posture. We have 2 authorization bills, lots of great oversight. We have been professional even when we have disagreed, and I think at the end of the day, that dialogue has been important for the community to move forward in that classified realm. So I think Americans get to see publicly, you all here today, but it's that classified work that really makes a difference for our national security posture, and I think we can both say, from my ranking member and myself, that we appreciate all of your cooperation and the work that we've been able to do. I want to thank the ranking member and our fellow Democrats for making this committee a bipartisan effort on national security, and I think that's certainly refreshing, and we hope it's duplicated around this town. I'm going to get a little bit off statement. I thought the Senate hearing was instructive. I thought it was certainly highlighted some issues that deserve our attention, and I just want to cover 3 issues quickly, turn it over to my ranking member. On cyber, and I heard some of the comments made in the Senate hearing on cyber, and there seemed to be a little bit of finger-pointing. We are fighting a 2-front war today on cyber, and it is happening today. One where countries like China have embraced economic espionage as a part of a national security framework and are waging an unprecedented economic assault on United States companies and their intellectual property. And that second, and I believe growing threat of a large cyber disruption or attack is on its way because of the exponential capabilities that are growing with countries like China. Russia was good before and getting better. Other countries like Iran and others are investing heavily in their cyber capabilities, relatively cheap investment and a big bang for the buck if they're successful. I argue, given classified briefings that we've had, discussions with all of you and your counterparts in the working part of those agencies, that a cyber attack is on its way. We will suffer a catastrophic cyber attack. The clock is ticking and winding down. I have to say that we have admired this problem for a very long time. We've made movies about this problem for a while now. We have think-tanked this problem to death. We have created working groups across every executive branch to try to study the problem more and work on it. And I saw that some of the blame was going on to the community, and I'll take exception to that. I think that you all, given the resources that you have and the authorities that you have today, have done a phenomenal job on what is the hardest problem set that I think I've ever seen, because it's so complicated and so difficult, and the target set is large and growing still. So I do believe our problem here is, I hate to say it, the United States Congress. There are some 30 bills, cyber bills out there. Again, we have looked, studied, and understood the problem. There are lots of approaches. But at the end of the day, we must act. Congress must act. I will say that this is the only committee that's produced a bipartisan product. It's very narrowly focused. It has huge coalition support that we believe takes a small step to at least allow that sheet to be covered that's currently covering .mil and .gov and pull it over the .com realm. And I hope we can, I hope we find it in ourselves to understand the risk that we take by not taking action and get something done so that next year we can brag about the work that you have done to keep American networks safe. On reconciliation, I want to talk about that in my questions, but I want to commend the administration for keeping Congress fully informed. They didn't do so well on the advice and counsel part of this particular event. In a bipartisan way, some very strong conversations about opposition to the path forward they were taking on reconciliation with the Taliban. I think generally the comments were that we were going to legitimize non-state actors that we have been trying to delegitimize with the Afghan people for the last 10 years. And it sends a horrible message to the people that have been with the United States in Afghanistan: women, entrepreneurs, people who believe that democracy would bring a better day in Afghanistan. Normal Afghans don't want to any longer fear and be intimidated in their daily lives. It crosses a pretty dangerous line in a policy change in the United States that I find very disturbing. It sends a horrible message to the world's bad actors that soldiers, prisoners, citizens are now to be treated like commodities. I think that is a horrible precedent, and one that I hope this administration strongly reconsiders. Lastly, Iran. An Iran nuclear bomb triggers a nuclear arms race across the Middle East. I think of that there is no doubt. Iran's irrational leadership clearly and simply does not have peaceful intentions. It is clearly a state sponsor of terrorism. It is doing so in a breathtaking pace. Iran has systematically been involved, according to a State Department report that is based on Department of Defense statistics, killed as many, or at least has direct blood on their hands, just in Iraq alone, as many as 600 U.S. soldiers through proxies, through introducing weapons systems that are very, very lethal. They sponsored two of the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas. They're bankrolling the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime, even with its violent upswing of late. Following North Korea's lead, they have actively sought to subvert IAEA inspections and obligations. Iran continues to threaten to choke off the world's energy supply by closing the Strait of Hormuz, and their Navy's dangerous tactics in the Persian Gulf put our sailors at risk. In October of this year, and this is what I find so shocking, the Iranian operatives plan to set off a bomb in Washington, D.C. restaurant and assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States and kill countless American citizens, and thought it was worth the risk. Most concerning is, I think, how disjointed our policy on the Middle East is. I had a very senior Arab intelligence official tell me recently that if I could make him king for a day, what would you ask of the United States? And his quote was, "Sir, you could please tell me what your Middle East policy is." Makes you pause, given the nature and danger of the world that is certainly evolving in the Middle East, and just how serious the consequences are for our national security. And we hope to flesh that a little bit out today in our questions. I want to congratulate Congress for its two bipartisan bills pushing the administration for sanctions. The second round, I think, is having devastating impact. It's something that I hope we can also explore today. You know, given the cuts that are coming, we know that. We think that we worked well with the intelligence community last year in a bipartisan way, found over $1 billion in savings through efficiencies without impacting mission. We think we gave at the office when it comes to intelligence, given the world's threats and what faces the United States of America. And we hope to work with you again to say that maybe we can find some efficiencies, but we also ought to make sure we make the right investments in our intelligence community to give policymakers an opportunity to respond versus react. I want to thank you again for being here today. I look forward to having discussions on those issues and many more. And I look forward to hearing your responses from all the members' questions today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our ranking member, Mr. Ruppersberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel. On my years on the Intelligence Committee, I see the four of you, General Burgess, Director Petraeus, Director Clapper, and Director Mueller. I think your leadership in the intelligence community is as good as I've seen it with a couple other your members, General Alexander and other members in this committee. And we look forward to having an open hearing. We know that there are many things that are classified that we can't talk about to protect our country, but I think it's important for the public to understand as much as they can, and we can inform them on what's going on and why intelligence is so important. The landscape has changed since the last worldwide hearing we had a year ago. 2011 was an important year for the intelligence community. From the heroic takedown of Osama bin Laden to the Arab Spring to the end of the war in Iraq and the change of leadership in North Korea. All these events dramatically impact our national security. The intelligence community could not have predicted every one of these events, but it is their challenge to give policymakers the information and tools they need to take action. The professionals in the intelligence community meet that challenge every day. When Chairman Rogers and I took over leadership of the committee last year, we made a commitment of bipartisanship. We both believe politics has no place in the Intelligence Committee. There is too much at stake protecting our country. We are working together with the other members of the Intelligence Committee as one team, Republicans and Democrats, to make a real difference and do what is right for the men and women risking their lives around the world to keep our country safe. We made a commitment to pass an intelligence budget every year to ensure proper oversight of the intelligence community and provide critical financial guidance. Last year, we passed not just one, but two Intelligence Authorization Acts for FY 2011 and FY 2012, with overwhelming bipartisan majorities. In fact, we had close to 400 votes in favor of each bill. And in this area of partisan politics, those numbers are pretty impressive. Last year marked the 10th anniversary of September 11th attacks, when close to 3,000 innocent Americans lost their lives. On that fateful day, we learned the Intelligence community was not sharing critical information that may have been able to prevent the tragedy, and the IC was not working together as well as it could. We spent the last 10 years trying to change that. The raid that eliminated al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden proves we've come a long way. It is clearly the most monumental intelligence achievement in recent memory and was the result of far-reaching teamwork. Our intelligence professionals worked together across different agencies, pulling together hundreds of pieces of information. They were methodical and persistent, and utilized every resource, capability, and authority they had. They figured out where Osama bin Laden was hiding, and they brought him to justice. But the threat from foreign terrorists as well as homegrown violent extremists still exists, and we cannot let our guard down. We must work together with our international allies to deny a safe haven for terrorists around the world, while also staying vigilant as we stop those who want to hurt us here at home. The intelligence community must continue to work hard to collect, analyze, and share information about the threats we face on our own soil as well as around the globe. No one could have predicted that a street vendor setting himself on fire in Tunisia could have sparked massive protests across the Middle East and North Africa, ushering in the turbulent Arab Spring. The leaders of Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya are no longer in power. These countries are attempting to embrace democratic ideals, but their future is still uncertain. The IC community continues to focus on that part of the world which has proven to be a perpetual hotspot. We must also continue to keep up with events in Yemen, where al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula is still plotting to kill Americans and disrupt our way of life. Even with the death of Anwar al-Awlaki, the charismatic al-Qaeda leader who inspired people to murder Americans with hate-filled media messages, we still have more work to do. Our intelligence community must have global reach, remain agile, and have the capability to address a variety of ever-changing threats, including Iran. Iran is a definite threat to world peace. Iran is trying to create a nuclear weapon and could destabilize the entire region and threaten American national security. Iran has become more brazen in their recent actions against our nation. The spoiled plot to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the UN on U.S. soil without any regard for American casualties crosses the line of state-sponsored terrorism. That is why Iran cannot be trusted and should not be allowed to create a nuclear weapon. A nuclear-capable Iran threatens our safety as well as the safety of Israel and the rest of the Middle East. The United States and the rest of the world must prevent Iran from creating a nuclear weapon. I agree with Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta when he talks about Iran, and his quote was, "There are no options that are off the table as it relates to Iran." In addition, North Korea, with its new young leader, Kim Jong-un, threatens to share his ballistic capabilities with Iran and Syria, further complicating the situation and threatening stability in the region. The intelligence community must keep close watch on this potentially volatile situation. At the same time, China and Russia are joining Iran with aggressive economic espionage depleting America of its valuable intellectual property, and now they are using technology as a weapon. A review released by the National Counterintelligence Center last year highlighted how China and Russia are using cyber hackers to steal valuable American ingenuity from the safety of our own soil. Cyber attackers are trying to capture America's cutting-edge research and development information that harness our competitive edge in the future. Some are calling it a cyber Cold War. $300 billion of intellectual property is stolen from American companies every year, according to the U.S. Cyber Command. Every day, U.S. websites and our nation's networks are threatened by foreign governments and criminal groups trying to steal our money, seize our valuable data, disrupt our critical services, or even shut them down, affecting millions of Americans. We know the threat is real because the websites have already been compromised. The NASDAQ and the International Monetary Funds have been hacked. Cyber vulnerabilities threaten key sectors of U.S. and global economy. Both the White House and Congress understand that cyber backbone of our critical infrastructure must be protected, and we have a long way to go. This is not the time when American economy can afford more instability. Now is the time to act as it relates to cybersecurity. The Intelligence Committee passed a bipartisan cyber legislation in December by a vote in our committee of 17-1. The Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, which is the bill, gives authority to share cyber threat intelligence, malware, malicious code, and other cyber signatures with industry. Companies can use this classified information to protect their cyber networks and the networks of their clients from cyber threats trying to defeat, disrupt, destroy, or otherwise disable them. This allows the private sector to benefit from the expertise of the intelligence community, all on a voluntary basis. The legislation will allow companies that power our homes, provide our clean water, and manage our other critical infrastructure information to protect themselves from cyber threats. The bill also, which is very important, protects privacy and civil liberties. And I applaud on my side Congressman Thornton, Congressman Thompson, Congresswoman Schakowsky, Congressman Langevin, and Congressman Schiff for working with us to deal in the issues of privacy and civil liberties. Another critical component to our national security is space. In 2011, the Department of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence published the first joint national security space strategy. It is a good start, but we need better definition as to the way ahead and how it leverages our commercial industry. The technology and expertise perfected by the space industry drives innovation in many critical areas, but because of trade restrictions such as ITAR and imagery resolution restrictions, we are losing our competitive edge on a daily basis. When it comes to launch, our systems are reliable, but they are too expensive because there is no competition. As a result, the United States cannot effectively get satellites in space because launch costs are too high and schedules are unpredictable. Commercial imagery is a critical component of our national security. We must support this commercial industry and promote both policies and funding that help it compete domestically and internationally. Current resolution restrictions prevent our commercial imagery industry from selling its best product. Today, France is marketing imagery at a half meter. As a result, countries like China are purchasing France's imagery to have a perfect view of U.S. military and strategic forces worldwide. I cannot emphasize enough that U.S. companies must be allowed to compete in a free market. This competition will promote innovation in our space industry. Finally, I want to address the resource challenges that we face and their impact on national security and the efforts of our intelligence community. The President has stated that he wants to curb and trim defense spending without impacting mission. The Intelligence Authorization Act for FY 2011 and 2012 did that. We will soon have the opportunity to review the President's budget request for fiscal year 2013. In this tight budget environment, we are committed to continuing to give our intelligence professionals the resources, capabilities that they need to keep our country safe. Our nation deserves no less. I look forward to hearing from you all, and again, thank you for coming before us today to educate our public on the issues of intelligence. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ruppersberger. I'm going to turn it over to you, Director Clapper. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Ruppersberger, and distinguished members of the committee for inviting us to present the 2012 Worldwide Threat Assessment. And let me say to both of you that I completely agree with your characterization about your leadership of the committee and the manner in which we are working together.
Thanks for the word.
And we all We all appreciate that, and specifically to Ranking Nuersberger's comments that you have more than lived up to your initial commitment to make this bipartisan and as a partnership, acknowledging the fact that as you alluded, we're not always going to agree. I'm joined today by distinguished intelligence community colleagues. To my right, CIA Director David Petraeus, and to his right, DIA Director Lieutenant General Ron Burgess, and to my left, FBI Director Bob Mueller. These remarks and our statement for the record reflect the collective insights of the extraordinary men and women of the United States intelligence community whom it is our privilege and honor to lead. And again, we are most appreciative of your acknowledgment of the work, sometimes under very hazardous conditions, that are done by the men and women of the community around the world. We won't attempt to cover the full scope of worldwide threats in these brief oral remarks, so I'd like to highlight some of the issues that we identified for the coming year, some of which you've already done for us. Never has there been, in my almost 49-year career in intelligence, in fact, today is the 51st anniversary of my enlistment in the Marine Corps on 2 February 1961. Anyway, in the time I spent in intelligence, I don't recall a more complex and interdependent array of challenges than we face today. The capabilities, technologies, know-how, communications, and environmental forces aren't confined by borders and can trigger transnational disruptions with astonishing speed, as we have seen in the past year. Never before has the intelligence community been called upon to master such complexity on so many issues in such a resource-constrained environment. We're rising to the challenge by continuing to integrate the intelligence community, taking advantage of new technologies, implementing new efficiencies, and, as always, simply working hard. But candidly, maintaining the world's premier intelligence enterprise in the face of shrinking budgets will be a challenge. We will be accepting and managing risk more so than we've had to do in the last decade. And when I say we, I mean both the legislative and the executive. We begin our threat assessment, as we did last year, with the global issues of terrorism and proliferation. The intelligence community sees the next 2 to 3 years as a critical transition phase for the terrorist threat, particularly for al-Qaeda and like-minded groups. With Osama bin Laden's death, the global jihadist movement lost its most iconic and inspirational leader. The new al-Qaeda commander is less charismatic, and the death or capture of prominent al-Qaeda figures has shrunk the group's top leadership layer. However, even with its degraded capabilities and its focus on smaller, simpler plots, al-Qaeda still remains a threat. As long as we sustain the pressure on it, we judge that core al-Qaeda will be of largely symbolic importance to the global jihadist movement. But regional affiliates, and to a lesser extent small cells and individuals, will drive the global jihad agenda. Proliferation, that is, efforts to develop, acquire, or spread weapons of mass destruction, is also a major global strategic threat. Among nation-states, Iran's technical advances, particularly in uranium enrichment, strengthen our assessment that Iran is more than capable of producing enough highly enriched uranium for a weapon if its political leaders, specifically the Supreme Leader, choose to do so. North Korea's export of ballistic missiles and associated materials to several countries, including Iran and Syria, as you alluded in your opening remarks, illustrate the reach of the North's proliferation activities. We don't expect Kim Jong-un, North Korea's new young leader, to change Pyongyang's basic policy of attempting to export most of its weapon systems. I would note that in this year's statement for the record, we elevated our discussion of cyber threats to follow terrorism and proliferation. And perhaps a little bit of coals to Newcastle, just to affirm that cyber threat is one of the most challenging ones we face for the reasons you described. We foresee a cyber environment in which emerging technologies are developed and implemented before security responses can be put in place. Among state actors, we are particularly concerned about entities within China and Russia conducting intrusions into U.S. computer networks and stealing U.S. data. And the growing role that non-state actors are playing in cyberspace is a great example of the easy access to potentially disruptive and even lethal technology and know-how by such groups. Two of our greatest strategic cyber challenges are, first, definitive real-time attribution of cyber attacks, that is, knowing who carried out such attacks and where the perpetrators are located, and secondly, managing the enormous vulnerabilities within the IT supply chain for U.S. networks. Briefly, looking geographically around the world, in Afghanistan during the past year, the Taliban lost some ground, but that was mainly in places where the International Security Assistance Forces, or ISAF, were concentrated. And Taliban senior leaders continue to enjoy safe haven in Pakistan. ISAF's efforts to partner with Afghan national security forces are encouraging, but corruption and governance challenges continue to threaten the Afghan forces' operational effectiveness. Most provinces have established basic governance structures, but they struggle to provide essential services. The ISAF and the support of Afghanistan's neighbors, notably and particularly Pakistan, will remain essential to sustain the gains that have been achieved. And although there is broad international political support for the Afghan government, there are doubts in many capitals, particularly in Europe, about how to fund Afghanistan initiatives after 2014. In Iraq, violence and sporadic high-profile attacks continue. Prime Minister Maliki's recent aggressive moves against Sunni political leaders have heightened political tensions. But for now, the Sunnis continue to view the political process as the best venue to pursue change. Elsewhere across the Middle East and North Africa, those pushing for change are confronting ruling elites, sectarian, ethnic, and tribal divisions, a lack of experience with democracy, stalled economic development, military and security force resistance, and regional power initiatives. These are fluid political environments that offer openings for extremists to participate more assertively in political life. States where authoritarian leaders have been toppled, such as Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, have to reconstruct or construct their political systems through complex negotiations among competing factions. In Syria, regime intransigence and social divisions are prolonging internal struggles and could potentially turn domestic upheavals into regional crises. In Yemen, although a political transition is underway, the security situation continues to be marred by violence and fragmentation of the country as a real possibility. As the ancient Roman historian Tacitus once observed, the best day after a bad emperor is the first. After that, I would add, things get very problematic. The intelligence community is also paying close attention to developments across the African continent, throughout the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and across Asia. Here, too, few issues are self-contained. Virtually every region has a bearing on our key concerns of terrorism, proliferation, cybersecurity, and instability. And throughout the globe, whenever there are environmental stresses on water, food, and natural resources, as well as health threats, economic crises, and organized crime, we see ripple effects around the world and impacts on U.S. interests. Amidst these extraordinary challenges, it's important to remind this distinguished body and the American people that in all of our work, the U.S. intelligence community strives to exemplify American values. We carry out our missions with respect for the rule of law and the protection of civil liberties and privacy. That pledge leads me to a crucial recommendation to you on our highest legislative priority this year, and it requires the support of this committee and both houses of Congress. I refer specifically to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Amendment Act, or FAA, which is set to expire at the end of 2012. Title VII of FISA allows the intelligence community to collect vital information about international terrorists and other important targets overseas. This law authorizes surveillance of non-U.S. persons located overseas who are of foreign intelligence importance, meaning they have a connection to or information about threats such as terrorism or proliferation. It also provides for comprehensive oversight by all three branches of government to protect the privacy and civil liberties of U.S. persons. The Department of Justice and my office conduct extensive oversight reviews of these activities, and we report to Congress on implementation and compliance twice a year. Intelligence collection under FISA produces crucial intelligence that is vital to protect the nation against international terrorism and other threats. We're always considering whether there are changes that could be made to improve the law, but our first priority is reauthorization of these authorities in their current form. We look forward to working with you to ensure the speedy enactment of legislation reauthorizing the FISA Amendments Act so there can be no interruption in our ability to use these authorities to protect the American people. So I'll end this brief statement where I began. The fiscal environment we face as a nation and in our intelligence community will require careful identification and management of the challenges the intelligence community focuses on and the risks we must mutually assume. With that, I thank you and the members of this committee for your dedication to the security of our nation, your support for our men and women of the intelligence community, and for your attention today. My colleagues and I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Thank you, Director, and congratulations on your 51st anniversary of your enlistment. And I bet boot camp looks pretty good, according to right about now.
It does.
The ranking member and I have agreed to allow a few members to work through their questions, and with that in mind, I'll turn it to Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Clapper, I want to start with Afghanistan. Has the intelligence community produced an agreed-upon written assessment of what the Afghanistan security forces' capabilities will be in 2013?
Sir, I guess the most current such rendering would have been addressed in the National Intelligence Estimate that we recently published.
Well, I noticed in your statement you said that there has been some loss of the Taliban insurgency in areas where we have troops, but it remains resilient and capable of challenging U.S. and international goals. I also noted that there was articles in the British press yesterday they said was some sort of U.S. military report. I don't know if it was or not, but it says that the Taliban's strength and morale are largely intact and talks about a significant number of defections to the Taliban. And so I'm concerned about the announcement that was made yesterday that we're going to end all combat roles in 2013 and just be in a supporting role. General Petraeus, you have obviously the most recent direct involvement there. Maybe we ought to start by just asking the question, is there a good reason for us to be in Afghanistan with military forces who are fighting and dying? And if so, what is that reason?
I would ask General Petraeus to speak to that.
Thanks, Congressman. There is indeed. We went there for a very important reason. We're still there for a very important reason, and that is to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a sanctuary once again for al-Qaeda or other extremists so that they can do what they did prior to 9/11, which was to plan the 9/11 attacks on that soil. If I could, I might want to clarify a couple of points as well that you've touched on here briefly. Before doing that, though, I actually would like to address the committee as a whole and the Chairman and the Ranking Member and thank you as well for your recognition of the personnel of the intelligence community who have indeed, as you noted, been part of some very important progress against extremists and others. To thank you for your support of those men and women in a whole variety of different fashions, but most materially, of course, in the 2 authorization bills, and then to note that we in turn have worked very hard to keep the committee and the SISI and the Congress fully and currently informed, and we will strive to do that, obviously.
I appreciate it, General, but my time is ticking. So.
Now, with respect to, first of all, the U.S. report, that is a report that's done annually by a U.S. element, Special Operations element, and it encapsulates interrogations of detainees. And it is interesting because you almost should have on the top of this the warning that is occasionally on the top of human intelligence that says this individual may have sought to influence as well as to inform. Needless to say, these are individuals who have been captured, in some cases knew there was some risk of that, and we think, in fact, in some cases they have a message. It is very interesting to contrast that with their messages to each other prior to their capture. We have insights into that as well, and in many cases they are, frankly, apprehensive, I think would be an understatement, because they have indeed been targeted quite effectively by ISAF and by now increasingly Afghan Special Operations Forces. what they did say is not all that different, frankly, from what we have observed in other documents, which is that there has been progress against the Taliban, but indeed the progress, as always, remains fragile and reversible, and the enemy is indeed resilient as well. And that was also in the NIE, which was for post-2014, by the way, and again postulated the risks and so forth of various scenarios.
Well, let me excuse the interruption, but my time is rendering. I guess the question I've got is this announcement yesterday. And you just said the NIE is out to 2014, and you have dealt with tribal leaders in Afghanistan. So if the U.S. announces we're going to end combat roles and we're going to be gone by 2014, and you're a tribal leader in Afghanistan, what effect does that have on you about what side you're going to support?
Well, thanks, Congressman. First of all, let me just say that I think that the quote announcement, the conversation that Secretary Panetta had with some press on his plane, was more than a bit overanalyzed, shall we say. The policy adopted by the leaders of the coalition, of the ISAF coalition, with Afghan President Karzai at the Lisbon summit — I was COM-ISAF at the time — in the latter part of over a year, 15 months or so ago, was that by the end of 2014, ISAF will have transitioned all security tasks to Afghan forces. To do that, we embarked on a policy of transition progressively over time. In fact, the first transition of security tasks, of leadership of security tasks from ISAF to Afghan forces took place in July 2011 when I was still the COM-ISAF. There's a subsequent transition that is being completed right now. And what Secretary Panetta was discussing was indeed this progressive transition. And if you're going to have it completed totally by the end of 2014, obviously, somewhere in 2013, you have had to initiate that in all of the different locations so that you can complete the remaining tasks. And that was what he was talking about. In fact, our U.S. Army brigades that go in there will actually have an augmentation to enable them to perform more and more and more the combat enabling role rather than the combat leadership role. They'll have what are called security force advisory teams to augment them. And again, the idea is that we gradually stop leading combat operations. The Afghan forces gradually take the leadership. It's in a successive series of transitions that take place as a result of a whole process between Afghan and ISAF leadership. And again, I think there's, as I stated up front on this one, his comments have been more than overanalyzed.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service to our country, and please pass that on to all the brave men and women who work in the intelligence community under all of you. It's very much appreciated. I have a couple of questions. General Petraeus, the Iranian plot uncovered last year to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador here in the United States, what has emboldened Iran to move in that direction, and do you assess Iran's willingness to sponsor future attacks here in the United States?
Well, that plot, I think the only way to characterize that is to say that that was really quite reckless. It was a case in which, of course, someone was going to recruit a hitman, basically, to come here to Washington, to the Cafe Milano of all places, and to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. And it reflected a degree of recklessness that is probably more pronounced than we have seen in the past, although it's important to note that various Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, some of the organizations in Iraq, Saab al-Haq, Kataib Hezbollah, have indeed also been active in a variety of plots, some of which have been interrupted. In fact, there's been a public statement about that out of Thailand, of course, a plot that was disrupted there. So we have seen arguably a bit more of that in recent years than in the past. Hard to account for that shift in thinking that might lead them to that. I would hope that the interruption, the disruption of this plot, and when the legal case comes out and so forth, will give pause to the Quds Force as they contemplate further such activities.
I might add, in terms of a possible explanation for this, of course, the Iranian narrative has been, or they talk themselves into a belief that Arab Spring represents an advancement, if you will, for them, opportunities for them to extend their reach. And there's that factor, and the fact that they may also feel somewhat under siege. And so we've seen this general
From the sanctions under siege?
well, sanction and in general the international pressure that's been placed on Iran by virtue of their nuclear activities.
And General Clapper, do you see any indication that this sort of activity will raise its ugly head again?
Well, it will. I mean, this is, again, a part of a general campaign, either through their proxies, as Director Petraeus indicated. And the proxies, notably Hezbollah, have been as aggressive as they ever have been in the last decade or so. So I expect we'll see more of this. And I think it's a general commentary, and even as we are not quite as preoccupied with al-Qaeda, that this is going to morph to other forms of such non-state activity that we have to be vigilant about, both here and elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. I think we all know that we can't continue to grow our budget and our workforce in a manner we did after 9/11. And Director Clapper, you stated that we need to find efficiencies and savings. And earlier this year, you indicated that you'd have a way ahead in doing this by this last December. And I'm interested to know what actions you've taken to try and identify and find some of those savings and what we can expect to save, and if you can point to any successful intelligence community-wide efforts in regard to enterprise licenses that have allowed us to capture economies of scale and improve our cross-agencies' abilities.
Well, sir, I think next week we'll be rolling out the National Intelligence Program budget as part of the larger budget, and and of course we'll have subsequent hearings on budget. But I'll just say here at the outset, we've worked hard as a corporate body, I think, to lay out a roadmap for how we can reduce and achieve efficiencies. I think the big idea, frankly, for the intelligence community is this notion of going to the cloud and with attendant attention to security, identity management, et cetera, and having a single IT enterprise, a subject we've talked about for years in the intelligence community, and now I think we're impelled to do it, and we have the technology and the wherewithal and the leadership to do it. Most important to this is Director Petraeus' commitment to join into this intelligence enterprise. I think potentially there are huge savings here, particularly in the IT arena. So looking to the future, that's, as I say, is the big idea, looking ahead.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. Ms. Myrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the issues that I follow very closely over quite a period of time is what's happening with Iran in South America and what they're doing, you know, in Mexico in particular, relative to us. And so, Lieutenant General Burgess, I just wanted to ask you, I know that over the past few years, DIA, along with the Defense Department, has worked with Homeland Security, excuse me, on the southwestern border. Sorry. And I understand that you all want to terminate those operations coming up, and I had recently sent a letter to you and to the Office of Management and Budget, you know, just asking if you would relook that, simply because of what's happening, not just with Mexico and the drug cartels, but with Iran. And, you know, we've all been talking about it this morning, and it does concern me. You know, when you look, and again, it's been mentioned over and over, but the attack by the Quds, or the potting by the Quds force relative to the Saudi ambassador, and what kind of access they have here into the United States across that southern border, it just seems like by continuing the operations of being on that border, it's going to lessen that threat in the sense that we have a better chance of stopping something. And so, you know, I also have the question of what are they going to do, and I know it's been answered previously relative to what they're going to do here in the United States, you know, continued plotting, et cetera. But it just seems to me like this is an important mission, and I just wondered why, if you could just give me some insight into why this is happening and if anything going to take its place.
Ma'am, first, I would agree very much so that it is an important mission. And we are in consultation with the Director of National Intelligence because Defense Intelligence Agency's role in terms of how we do some of these missions along the border is we provide some research and development technology that we look at providing.
Right.
We come up with a capability. Once we have a capability, then who best inside the intelligence community along our border should own that capability? So I understand you have submitted a letter, and we're in current discussion on that now.
Well, you know, it can, you know, we look back at what's happening in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood and, you know, how things are changing over there. I know, General Clapper, you and I have discussed this many, many times. And, you know, this isn't a good situation, and I just don't want to see the same thing developing here in the United States because it's very obvious what their intent is relative to what they intend to do to us over the long term. So, I mean, that's really a major issue with me. And anything that you can get back to me on that, I would appreciate very much. The other question I had was on Russia's involvement in Syria. You know, what they've been doing over the years, where they are right now, and how they are really not being upfront with us, how they continue to supply them, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I know we've got this reset policy with Russia, but what's really happening with that?
Well, the Russians have been very protective, I guess I'd say, of the Assad regime, and as they have, particularly with respect to potential UN Security Council resolution. And I think that stems, frankly, from a long time and profitable client relationship, which they very much want to preserve.
Right.
And so I think that's what that's about. And just a general aversion when they have a chance to be assertive in the world fora.
Well, you know, where does it stand relative to what we are doing with Russia, not just with Syria, but with the whole situation with Russia? I mean, are we doing anything to make any progress with them? I mean, is it working? I know they seem to be very obstinate in everything that they do.
Well, I think the New START treaty, it could be seen as a positive.
Right.
But in truth, it wasn't done for altruistic reasons. It was done for pragmatic, budgetary, programmatic reasons. But that's an area where the interests converge, so we agreed. I think it's well known the Russians are paranoid about missile defense and the implications that has, and they, to use Director Petraeus' apt term, they overanalyze that and deduce that's a profound threat to their status as a national power. So where our agreements converge, where our interests converge, there'll be agreement, and there'll be many cases where they don't.
Well, thank you all for what you do. You've heard it many times, but we do appreciate you.
Well, I was going to, Chairman, thanks. And another example, actually, of cooperative endeavor is the Northern Distribution Network that supplies Afghanistan through the north. Transits, one of the ways of that transits Russian soil. It's very important, especially as Pakistan has closed the NATO ground lines of communication that run through Pakistan. So in this case, of course, it's not in Russia's interest to see Afghanistan fall to the Taliban again, or to see the illegal narcotics industry or extremism penetrate further north into the Central Asian states than it already has. And so that's an area in which they've been cooperative. Obviously, there's some commercial interests as well, but there's a huge security interest for us engaged in this.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your testimony, for the extraordinary work that you're doing on behalf of the country, and I hope that you will express our appreciation to the men and women in the intelligence community who do this job a thankless job in many ways, day in and day out. We are greatly in their debt. I want to, first of all, associate myself with the comments of the Chairman and Ranking Member. We talked a lot about cybersecurity here today, and it's appropriate that we're focusing on one of the most serious threats that are facing the country today. I've spent a lot of time on this issue, and like the Chairman, I believe that a catastrophic cyber attack is coming to this country, and we had better get prepared. Time is running out. I appreciate the work that you're attempting to do in this area, given the constraints that you have, and perhaps not having the proper authorities. And we obviously have to redouble our efforts in this area in every way possible. I do want to focus right now on the issue of cyber espionage, because that is something that is happening right now to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year that we are losing to foreign adversaries that are stealing our intellectual property, particularly those that would affect our national security. In October of 2011, the National Counterintelligence Executive indicated that China and Russia are responsible for extensive illicit intrusions into U.S. Cyber networks and theft of U.S. intellectual property. So my question is, what do you recommend to further protect against cyber-enabled espionage and theft? And in your opinion, what legislative changes are needed to facilitate better protections against cyber-enabled espionage and theft?
Well, first, I agree with, I think we all do agree with your characterization. I think General Alexander has characterized what's going on here with, particularly with the Chinese, as probably the greatest pillaging of wealth in history, if you totaled up the, the value of the intellectual property that has been stolen. So it does obviously point up the need for a rational and comprehensive cyber protection policy for the whole country, which does account for due consideration for civil liberties and privacy. What I personally like to get kind of specific about things to try to envision what could be scaled up, but I have always touted what former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bill Lynn did in leading the Defense Industrial Base pilot, which has evolved into, I think, a great model for particularly what the intelligence community's role should be in all this, which is to provide threat information and advice on the larger infrastructure beyond that of the government. And I believe that kind of approach is what is workable. There are all kinds, the Chairman and the Ranking alluded to the many bills, 30 or 50 or so in the Congress. There is one proposed by the administration. And there was a kind of a seminar session here on this week with the Senate on this subject, and I think the White House is trying to arrange a similar session here in the House. There are some profound policy issues, who's in charge issues that we in the intelligence community, I don't think can prognosticate or recommend. But the way we are set up now to react and respond, both foreign and domestic, it marks a team effort across the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, Department of Justice. The FBI is a huge player here, and Department of Homeland Security. But it's clear from all that we've said, and I hope that the predictions about a massive attack don't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But clearly, everyone's attention is alerted to this, and we do need to do something. But as far as what to do, I would just commend the Defense Industrial Base pilot as a good model, and it connotes the organizing principle, I think, of the importance of a partnership between the government and all the private sectors. This cannot be done all by the government all by itself.
My time is almost up, but I thank you for your thoughts, and I am very pleased that this committee passed the bill that the Chairman, the Ranking Member, and all of us really worked on the information sharing side. It does talked to the importance of the DIB pilot program, and hopefully that will lead to greater success. I think that we have a greater strength on the information sharing side, and hopefully this bill will move its way through the Congress soon. So, I really do appreciate the time and effort, the focus that this committee has faced, is put into this issue, and thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for their collaborative work on this. I have other questions that I will submit to the record. I am concerned about supply chain issues, particularly as it relates to cyber, but I will submit those for the record, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, gentlemen, thanks for coming. I want to hit a couple of things real quick that have already been asked and then get to something a little broader. With respect to Afghanistan, has the IC changed or amended their analysis as to the capacity of the Karzai government to control their country over the last couple of months that would have given rise to, and I know, David, you said we overanalyzed what Leon said yesterday, but that's a startling statement. Has the IC changed their assessment of Afghanistan and their capabilities over the last several months, and if so, why?
Again, look, with respect, Congressman, I think it was a startling over-analysis, not necessarily a startling statement. If you go back and read what he said,
okay,
but
so the IC is not,
sir, if I could, this is exactly in line with the policy that we started back in the summer of 2011, transitioning leadership of combat operations from ISAF to Afghan forces.
well, let me just say this.
And then progressively you complete it by the end of 2014.
I understand, David. It's attributed to Leon that he said would have all troops out by the end of 2013.
He did not say that.
Okay.
He said all troops out, I think, withdraw forces by the end of 2014.
All right, well,
but of course, the President has stated an enduring security relationship that would indicate something that would continue beyond that, as have the leaders of other major coalition countries who just signed agreements with President Karzai.
So at this stage, the IC's assessment of capabilities has not dramatically changed from what it's been over the last several months?
No, sir.
Okay. With respect to Iran and the leadership there, given it appears to be they've got actually nothing to lose at this stage as they move down this list or down this path with sanctions and others, can you give us some sense as to what impact Syria's collapse and a change in regime there would have on Iran and their intentions?
Well, sir, I might respectfully take issue with the notion that they've had nothing to lose. I think they have a lot to lose, and I think as the international pressure ratchets up, as the sanctions, particularly the ones that are in the process of being implemented, take hold, they have a lot to lose. And I think their economy is already is already seeing the effects of that with the devaluation of the real and also high unemployment rates, the draining of their banking reserves, the difficulty they have conducting international financial transactions. So they are already paying a price. It is also causing, we understand, there is debate and dissension within the Iranian leadership hierarchy. There's a question, as we discussed some yesterday at another hearing, about the extent to which the Iranian leadership, notably the Supreme Leader himself, just how connected he is with reality, what kind of information he is getting. I think there are growing signs of dissent among the Iranian populace because of the impacts that all this is having on their quality of life.
And Syria?
Well, Syria, of course, is, and one reason why one reason the Iranians have expended a great deal of time, energy, resources, and people on trying to prop up Assad is because of having access to that territory and also as another client. So they are very concerned about keeping Assad in power.
Earlier in your conversation, you talked about as resources shrink across the system that we are going to have to accept risks. How are you going to communicate with decision makers risks that we are going to have to take because we don't allocate resources to those risks? And can you give us some sort of a sense of how you are going to approach this idea of that we as a community are not going to have the resources that we might otherwise enjoy?
Well, as we always have when we've gone through these cyclical patterns of expansion, which we've done the last 10 years, every year we've gotten, the intelligence community's gotten more money, more people. We went through this in the 90s after the fall of the wall, and we were induced to take reductions, which frankly we didn't manage very well. And so, for one, I'm going to try to profit from that experience and not neglect things that we did then. Try to preserve and protect, first, our most important resource in the intelligence community, which is our people, and those resources and capabilities that provide us a global capability so that we can react and respond anywhere in the world. We don't cover the earth like Sherwin-Williams paint. There are some things we will pay less attention to, the less critical problems. And when, we're not going to do more with less and all these other cliches, we will just simply have less capability. So in a closed environment, we'll certainly be able to, discuss that more, particularly when we have our budget deliberations. And certainly we'll advise the White House and certainly you as to where we may be taking some risk.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your comments. I'd be derelict in my duty if I didn't mention the fact that across that issue is the idea that your financial statements of your organizations are not auditable at this point in time, and that better information, better IT systems, and better internal controls would allow all of us to have a better sense as to where those monies are going or not going. So,
sir, you're absolutely right, and that gives me an opening to thank you. In the Intelligence Authorization Act, the provision for the funds balance with Treasury, which is crucial to auditability in the intelligence community. We will be discussing with you in our FY13 budget as well some funding that we will need for financial management.
yeah, thank you. And I appreciate it. We got some pushback from the Department of Defense on that issue, so I appreciate your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway. Mr. Chakowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I think that open hearings are very important for the public to hear some reports from the intelligence community. So I thank you for coming. There have been recent media reports that indicate that the NYPD, New York Police Department, used biased and misleading materials to train officers on Islam. And last year, I asked you, Director Mueller, about a similar situation in the FBI, and I have a couple questions. But also, Director Petraeus, press reports have discussed ties between the NYPD and the CIA, and I'll have a couple questions on that as well. But Director Mueller, since our last discussion about this, what steps have been taken to standardize training in the FBI so situations like this don't occur? And was the review of FBI training we discussed completed, and when will we see a copy of this review?
Congresswoman, as we had discussed before, and you're aware, last summer we had indications that there were problems in terms of our training in this area. And we developed a two-step process to respond. The first was to look through our materials and put together a panel of experts, both from within the FBI but also from outside the FBI, to look at our training materials and to identify the best practices when it comes to training in this arena, so that any training in the future will be done according to the guidelines that this panel had put together. Secondly, we undertook a review of the training that had been done since September 11th in the last 10 years, and looked through those materials to determine those materials that were inappropriate in some way, and to make certain that they did not show up in training in the future, but also to assure that any training that had been done pursuant to that was rectified. We've gone through approximately 160,000 pages of materials that have been used in training in the Bureau over the last 10 years. Far less than 1% of those materials has any inappropriate material in it. We also have been disclosing these training materials over a substantial period of time in response to FOIA requests. The review that you mentioned is going into its ending stages, And my expectation is the next few weeks or month we should be completing that review, and at which point in time we will again brief you and your staff as to what we have found and what we anticipate doing in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention to the issue. I appreciate it. Director Petraeus, I'm wondering if your officers have had any involvement in the NYPD training on Islam. And in addition, the press is reporting the assignment of the CIA officer detailed to the NYPD is being curtailed in early April. And I'm wondering what that individual was doing there and if that report is correct.
Well, thanks very much. On the first question, I need to get back to you on the record on that to be sure that I have the absolute precise answer on it. On the other issue, what I would say is that, as we've briefed the committee before, the IG has looked into the provision of agency personnel in the wake of 9/11 to provide liaison with New York's finest, given how New York has been such a prominent target of extremists. The IG determined that there was no violation of law or executive order. And as you mentioned, for what it's worth, the final agency augmentee who has been there on a fellowship over the course of the past year will rotate back at the completion of his tour this spring and will ensure the liaison between the agency and New York's finest through another mechanism that Ray Kelly and I have established.
And Director Clapper, you're quoted, well, actually there's not quotes around it, but it says in an article that you thought the arrangement looks bad and will be addressed. I wondered if you wanted to.
Well, what I specifically said at the time, in fact, it was the last time we had an open hearing on this, I just thought it was a bad optic. That's not to say there was any, and as the CIA IG in his investigation, which I've read, found no illegality. And the other concern I would have is just the precedent in a resource-constrained environment of other police departments asking for similar support from the National Intelligence Program. And so in this era of austerity that we're entering, from that standpoint too, I thought that was something we'd have a hard time sustaining.
Thank you.
If I could follow up on that, Congressman, I think it is fairly reasonable in the wake of something like the 9/11 attacks for all of the intelligence and law enforcement agencies to try to figure out how they can help the city that was the object of that attack and has continued to be the object of that attack. And so, again, I shouldn't imply by my statements that this is something that, was untoward. In fact, as I mentioned, the IG found no violation of law or executive order. But what we have determined is still an efficient and effective way to ensure that there is the kind of liaison that is necessary and that goes on all around our country, but without the provision of somebody actually to the forces.
There is controversy around the demographics unit at the NYPD, however, and their relationship and appropriateness of their activities regarding the Muslim community. I just wanted to make sure that we're paying attention to all these civil liberties issues. Thank you.
Understand fully. Thanks.
Ms. Schakowsky, I think it's good to note publicly the agency has been exceptionally good. We have been briefed on the report twice by the agency themselves, and the IG was made available to the committee to talk about the report. And the director was actually very good when the report came out to make sure that we had access to the information. We were all concerned about it. I thought that was handled exceptionally well. And again, the IG had the opportunity to come to the committee and talk about their investigation. Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say for the record first, the NYPD does a truly outstanding job in fighting counterterrorism. They have over 1,000 police officers dedicated to this. There have been a number of attacks against New York. At least 14 have been stopped because of the cooperation with the FBI, JTTF, all the local police agencies in New York. And I believe the relationship with the CIA has been extremely helpful and beneficial. I think it's been extremely irresponsible by the press to be some of the allegations they've made. Just a few I'd like to put here in the record. Associated Press, General Petraeus, last August 23rd, quote, "With CIA help, NYPD moves covertly in Muslim areas." The New York City Police Department is targeting ethnic communities in many ways would run afoul of civil liberties practiced by the Federal Government, and Associated Press investigation has found. These operations have benefited from unprecedented help from the CIA, a partnership that has blurred the line between foreign and domestic spying. We have January 27th from the Associated Press. The CIA's Inspector General completed an investigation into the relationship between the CIA and the NYPD after AP articles showed the police collaborated with the Federal Spy Agency to set up operations to scrutinize Muslim communities, and they have helped build programs that have angered Muslim communities. We actually have members of Congress sending around a Dear Colleague letter and asking the Attorney General to carry out an investigation, saying we are deeply troubled by AP press reports that the New York Police Department, with the help of the CIA, has been collecting information on the Muslim community in New York City and surrounding areas. This would be a violation of civil rights and trigger a number of Federal laws. They then call on the Attorney General, saying that the NYPD, with the cooperation of the CIA, has engaged in efforts to collect information on the Muslim community in New York City and other jurisdictions. Recently, the New York Times says the CIA and the NYPD have an unusual and highly troubling relationship. I think it's disgraceful that the media has carried out these false reports for a number of reasons. The CIA can defend itself, the NYPD can defend itself, but these lies cause such trouble and such confusion and consternation in the Muslim American community. It makes it harder for the NYPD to carry out its job. I would wish members of Congress, before they just talk about press reports, would look into the facts behind them. And I just, again, want to go over with you, General Petraeus, the CIA Inspector General said there was no violation of the National Security Act as far as the relationship between the NYPD and the CIA. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if I could point out, Congressman, we should remember that the IG of the CIA is an independent individual. He is the only person in the agency beyond the Director who is nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate.
And he found out there was no violation of the National Security Act. He also concluded, did he also conclude that there was no executive order violated by the CIA or the NYPD?
That's correct.
Is there any evidence at all, the Inspector General find any evidence at all that the CIA carried out or engaged in any spying or any type of surveillance or clandestine activity in New York on its own or with the NYPD?
No.
Was there any evidence the NYPD in any way violated or abused its relationship with the CIA?
No.
I think it's very important that this be made known again and again, because this is causing, again, real problems within the Muslim American community. It's allowing politicians in New York and other places to take cheap shots at the NYPD, which, again, they can handle themselves, but it makes it very difficult for them to carry out their job. We have been attacked twice. I lost over 150 people in my district alone. I know what the NYPD is doing, and there's always room for legitimate criticism. Obviously, there's been some friction over the years with the NYPD and the FBI. That is legitimate, to me, friction that is involved when you have two leading law enforcement agencies. But to be spreading around lies of spying, clandestine activity, and also acting as if this is something unusual, to me is disgraceful. And I know the AP reporters are up for a Pulitzer Prize. I know that the New York Times is engaged in a campaign against the NYPD. But I think we should realize these are real threats. There are always ongoing threats. And as far as I can tell, I would hope that the CIA does nothing at all to diminish its level of support for the NYPD.
In fact, I've went up to New York, Congressman, to see things for myself. And for what it's worth, my assessment is, and met with the Commissioner, met with other law enforcement personnel, my impression is that there is a very good and very productive and very proper relationship between the various law enforcement agencies, that includes the FBI, by the way, and then also with elements of the intelligence community that appropriately provide in a proper way products of their intelligence collection and analysis.
Thank you, General. Mr. Chairman, I think it is important, again, for this to be on the record, the level of distortion that's been out here. And the AP, for instance, when they wrote the story about the what they disclosed, was totally untrue about spying by the CIA in New York, they call on the Justice, they announced the fact, or they reported the fact, that the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, was also calling for an investigation, never mentioning at all. They referred to them as a Muslim American civil rights organization, never ever mentioning that CAIR was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the most major terrorist funding case in this country, and that the FBI has cut off its contact with CAIR. So that's the type of bias and discrimination which I think we as a committee should stand up and speak out against, in which the members of this committee would line up with those who are doing the job and not ally themselves with cheap press reports. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. King. Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to the country. General Petraeus, I have 3 questions. My chief concern about Afghanistan is the safe haven in Pakistan. And my questions are these. First, do you anticipate any change in the status of the sanctuary that the insurgency finds in Pakistan? And second, if we can't expect that there's going to be much of a change in that safe haven for the Taliban insurgency, can we reasonably expect that the Afghan forces will be able to defend against an insurgency that enjoys that safe haven once we draw down our troops? And finally, should Afghan special forces be allowed to take the fight to the enemy leadership in Pakistan and end the sense of immunity from risk that the senior Taliban leadership enjoy in Pakistan?
Well, first of all, there's no question that there are elements in Pakistan that have enjoyed sanctuary and that cause major problems for Afghanistan and for the Afghan and coalition forces that are seeking to provide security to enable the development of the new Afghanistan. Having said that, there's also no question but that our Pakistani partners have confronted a number of the extremist organizations there, foremost among those al-Qaeda, and that cooperation does continue in various forms, but also the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistani and, again, a number of its affiliates. Now, admittedly, that organization is focused mostly on destabilizing Pakistan, but not entirely. It does cause problems for Afghanistan as well. But when it comes to the Haqqani network and to the Afghan Taliban, there's no question that more needs to be done to them. There is an important case recently where a very significant improvised explosive device expert and builder has been detained in Pakistan. Again, that is a very significant step. There are a couple of other developments recently, but I think we should be cautious in what we anticipate in terms of the ability of our Pakistani partners and, in some cases, the willingness to go after, again, the Haqqani network in the Federal Administered Tribal areas of the Afghan Taliban down in Baluchistan. They have sustained very heavy combat operations against the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistani and affiliates, and they have tried to squeeze some of these others, but again, the thought that they will go in and go after them is probably overly optimistic. If no change, the prospect that the Afghan security forces can continue the defense as in the past, I think that will depend on the amount of assistance that is provided, the character of that assistance, if you will. Are there enablers in addition to just, say, money or equipment or various traditional forms of security assistance? We have obviously nearly 3 years before the end of 2014 to develop that kind of what that will consist of. Noting again that not just President Obama, but the leaders of the other major coalition countries of the NATO forces in Afghanistan have all pledged continued support in varying forms for Afghanistan beyond the end of 2014. With respect, should the Afghan forces be allowed to go? Well, I think that's obviously a question for Afghanistan, but I think they probably have sufficient fights on their hands without invading the soil of another country, even as significant as is the threat that is posed by some of these safe havens across the border.
I wasn't suggesting so much an invasion as whether they should be able to carry targeted actions against leadership figures in the Haqqani network, for example.
Well, look, this is probably one that is best continued in a closed session, I think, to flesh out all the different issues that are at play here, and I'd ask that we probably do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director.
Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it rather ironic that 10 years ago the intelligence community was chastised for being stovepiping, for holding information back, and just to expand on what Mr. King was pointing out, that here we have the various intelligence agencies who are trying to work with the local PD to try to prevent terrorist attacks in the future, the very thing they were criticized for 10 years ago when 9/11 occurred. Now they are being criticized for actually doing what the Congress and the American public asked them to do, which was to work as closely as you can to protect civil liberties, but to make sure that we are sharing information across the board. And as it relates to the folks that I represent, I hope that that folks are focusing within the intelligence community on the activity of these drug cartels who are operating in Mexico, in other parts of South America, who are also operating in California and parts of the West, and I assume all over the country. Every day, innocent Americans are being killed in this country because of foreign drug cartels and other criminal activity. And so my only request of all of you in the intelligence community is that you please look for ways to cooperate and share information with the folks that I represent and the various sheriffs and DAs and folks that can be helpful if they need information on these cartels or other extremists, or if Peter King's constituents need help. I hope that you are hearing from at least some of us on this committee who do not want you to take this incident that occurred in New York or in the false press reports that are out there and somehow think that the Congress is now asking you and the American public is asking you to go ahead and start stovepiping again and not share information with our local law enforcement folks who are on the ground.
Sir, if I may, let me say a couple of things, and I'd like to have Director Petraeus add to this. This is one of the profound changes that's occurred to the intelligence community in the last 10 years, which was not the case prior to 9/11, is the interaction with state, local, tribal, and private sector. I take this as a major responsibility that I have and my staff to foster those interactions. I have engaged a lot with which I think is a great organization, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, who are very, very committed to this and very sophisticated in the ways of intelligence. And one of my thrusts for 2012 is to further, working with the DHS and the FBI, to refine and bring greater fidelity to that relationship. So I take your point, whether it's drugs or any other issues connected with terrorism or proliferation. Dave?
Well, I think, personally, the advent of the DNI and DHS in particular and all that has followed in the wake of that has brought about considerable progress in intelligence sharing and intelligence integration. Obviously, we are all committed to furthering that progress in the years that lie ahead. With respect to your comments, Congressman, I was just in Mexico and Colombia, met with the heads of state in each of those countries and with intelligence counterparts and other security officials. In fact, actually, we are hosting this afternoon a delegation from Mexico in return to discuss the way ahead in some of the areas that we were discussing there. I have to say I was impressed by the concepts that the Mexican leadership has adopted. The comprehensive approach is clearly the right way forward, and also by the establishment of institutions. Still early days in some cases, but the dramatic expansion of the national police, for example, of the penitentiary system, the corrections system, the attention to the need for various additional laws and so forth, all are exactly what are required to stem what is obviously a very, very serious challenge as manifested by the violence and the breakdown of the rule of law in some of the areas in Mexico. Colombia, on the other hand, has adopted a comprehensive approach for a number of years. It is now looking literally to take it to the next level, and we are obviously partnering with them as effectively as we can. As you know, the agency has a counter-narcotics center. This integrates not just those from within the agency, but throughout the intelligence community and indeed with law enforcement agencies as well. And that is something that we continue to focus a great deal of effort on, given the threat that it poses to our country and really to the world.
Well, myself and Mr. Boren were down in Colombia and Mexico, I think just prior to your arrival, and we're very happy with the success that all of you are having there in the intelligence community with our war on drugs and international crime. Mr. Mueller?
I just wanted to add very briefly on the working with state and local law enforcement. That has been the key to our success since September 11th. We have over 100 joint terrorism task forces in which state and local are represented. We have hundreds of task forces relating to violent crime, narcotics trafficking, what we call Safe Streets task forces, and have leveraged our capabilities throughout the country by coming together with state and local law enforcement in the task forces. And even with the threats of the future, including cyber, it is going to be in part, a large part dependent on our relationships, not just with other players, NSA, CIA, DIA and the like, but also our relationships with state and local law enforcement and building up the state and local law enforcement's capacity to address that threat as well as ourselves.
So I might also mention the 72 state and major metropolitan fusion centers for which the National Intelligence Program provides some funding to ensure, which is the nexus for providing information upward from local level to the national community and downward, which are another instrumentality that network that have grown since 9/11.
Thank you to the panel, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Mrs. Bachmann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you all so much for all the work that you've done on behalf of the American people. I know that my constituents are extremely grateful as well for the work that all of you do. But I just wanted to note that it was a year ago when we had all gathered here in this room for the public hearing. And at that time, we all had our televisions on, and we literally were observing history in the making with the Arab Spring, and we saw the events and the demonstrations occurring in Cairo, even as you were all speaking to this committee. And I'm just struck by the fact of what has occurred just in this last year. My questions are regarding Egypt in particular, and as we were observing that on television, since then we've seen an attack on the Israel embassy in Egypt. We also we've seen calls for breaking the 30-year peace treaty that's been enjoyed between Egypt and Israel. And also in this last year, we saw elections take place in Egypt when 75% of the parliament is now controlled by either the Muslim Brotherhood or elements of Salafists, Islamists who are both groups hostile to the United States, and with calls as well for implementing Sharia law in Egypt. And I just wondered if you could comment, in particular with Director Clapper. You had said to the committee a year ago that the Muslim Brotherhood was a secular organization. I just wondered, in light of some of those events in the last year, do you still stand by that statement that the Muslim Brotherhood is a secular organization?
I did not make myself clear in that statement clearly, obviously, and that's danger of, sound bites and all that sort of thing. And in a subsequent appearance before the SSCI, I tried to clarify that. What I was referring to was to that point, behavior within the political system, to participate in elections and this sort of thing. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is not run by religious scholars. It's mostly middle-class people. But to your point, to whether this is going to be for us a sheep in wolf's clothing remains to be seen. They have the other Salafist groups, Al-Noor and other related parties. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of political parties that have emerged as a result of the upheavals that have gone on in Egypt. This is something we need to watch very carefully as to what their real objectives are. There have been calls for the review of the treaty with Israel, and not surprisingly, Israel is very concerned about that. So I was not as precise when I made that statement a year ago about the Muslim Brotherhood as I should have been.
And thank you for your response. And I had another question about Egypt as well. Since Mubarak was overthrown, The Sinai has become a highway for the transport of terror personnel and material, and the cross-border terror attacks on Israeli motorists en route to Eilat in August and the repeated bombing of the Egypt-Israel gas pipeline are just two notable examples that we have observed. Egypt also has opened its land border with the Hamas-controlled Gaza, and currently we have 2 battalions, I believe, stationed in northern and southern Sinai as the lead force and the MFO observers in charge of ensuring the implementation of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. Would you, in your estimation, say that our U.S. forces are at risk and have their rules of engagement changed? And are they involved at all in efforts to prevent the transformation of Sinai into another terror haven that will continue to destabilize the peace between Israel and Egypt? And if so, how, and if not, why not?
I think at best, unless Director Petraeus knows this, probably best to consult with the Department of Defense on your question about the Sinai battalion that's there and whether or not their rules of engagement have changed. I don't know the answer to that, so we'll get that and supply it to you.
Hey, Congresswoman, first of all, I think it's important to note that in all of our interaction with our Egyptian counterparts, that the Egyptian government very much shares the concern over the emergence of the challenges in the Sinai, that some extremists have flocked there, that it has been used as a transit point for weaponry and so forth. And indeed, our sense is that they truly do take this very seriously, and we can talk a bit more about that perhaps in the closed session. With respect to the multinational force and observers, obviously it's my old area when I was a Central Command commander. Unless there's been a change, there's just one U.S. battalion there, and it's in the southern part of the Sinai, which is actually further away from this area that we're talking about. And there's another battalion from another international country that is in the north. I, again, would refer to the Department of Defense on the rules of engagement, although I can't imagine why there would need to be a change to them. They give every opportunity for self-protection, force protection, and so, again, I would be surprised if there has been a change.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Calvert. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back and revisit our southern hemisphere again. Mr. Nunes and Ms. Myrick brought it both up. Obviously, we almost had a failed state in Colombia a number of years ago. The United States stepped in forcibly and turned that around, and I think everyone here would say it's been a success story. Colombia is coming back. We just entered into a trade agreement that I think is mutually beneficial, but obviously we have significant problems in our southern hemisphere. Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Central America in many places is a basket case. Guatemala, I think, has the highest crime rate in the world. Last time I was there, I think they managed to make that list. And obviously, Mexico. 50,000 people have been killed in Mexico in the last 3 years. We had a discussion recently. As horrible as the number of deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq are, I suspect they may be higher in Mexico, right on our border, the United States. And that violence is coming across our border along our southern states, especially in states like Arizona, Texas. We still have problems in California. And I'd like to hear, what is our focus in South America? Obviously, we have significant problems in Central America, but we've got big problems right on our border. And these are our friends, and by golly, we need to make sure that we can help them out and help ourselves at the same time. I just want to mention, I head up the Meth Caucus, a number of us bipartisan group. This methamphetamine that's coming across the border is the worst drug we've ever seen. It's tremendously addictive. I think 90% of it, Director Mueller, I think comes from Mexico. The precursors are coming from China, India, everywhere else where they're mixing this stuff up. And the amount of money that's being made is obviously very corrupting to the folks in Mexico and to the United States. We've seen significant problems. So want to hear all your comments about what can we do in South America to focus on that problem that we have, which I think is a huge national security issue. Thank you.
Well, let me start and then ask Director Mueller and Director Petraeus to add in. Well, I think we all share your concern, not only as leaders of the intelligence community, but as American citizens, about the threats and issues that confront us in this hemisphere. And obviously, we've been focused on other things with 2 wars and all that sort of thing, and we've had problems right here in our own backyard. I think your mentioning of Colombia and Director Petraeus was just there has been a marked success story, certainly from an intelligence perspective, and the partnership that we forged with the Colombian government. We are extrapolating lessons learned from that in other places, notably Mexico. I think it also shows that this is a long, hard slog, and once a country is willing to partner with you, which some of them are, then the work begins. What concerns me is the network and that exists in Central America as a highway, if you will, for the drugs flowing northward. And we, even as we draw down, are trying to bring more resources to bear, which we can talk to perhaps in a closed session about what the U.S. Can do for our partner nations. And I think Director Petraeus could share in more detail in a closed session what we're attempting to do. Bob?
Yeah, Congressman, we're quite obviously very concerned about not only the numbers of homicides in Mexico, for Mexico, but also for the possibility of the spreading of the violence north of the border. We are focused in a number of directions. First of all, where there have been a spate of kidnappings, for instance, we have a number of kidnapping task forces that our agents on the border work with Mexican counterparts. Secondly, border corruption, as you pointed out, is a huge issue both south of the border but also north of the border. And we have 14 border corruption task forces that are addressing that particular area. The third area is making certain that the intelligence that we gather, or DEA gathers, or ICE gathers, or other law enforcement or intelligence agency in the United States is matched up with that intelligence that is derived below the border by the Mexican authorities, by the U.S. intelligence agencies, and consequently there is a concerted effort to make certain that there is substantial information sharing along the border. The last point I'd make has been pointed out is that cartels from Mexico have reached into the United States, seeing the lucrative markets, quite obviously, and not being suffice it to move the drugs over the borders, but exert control and have pockets of cartel personnel inside the United States. And to the extent that that is happening, we have enterprise investigations that are addressing those aspects of the movement of the cartels within the United States, understanding that the thrust of the defense along the border on the narcotics trafficking is Customs, Border Patrol, and DEA.
And Congressman, if I could, first of all, with respect to Colombia, we really have to give credit to some very courageous Colombian leaders over the years who implemented a very difficult strategy. Certainly, we provided considerable assistance, but it was their police and their military that really implemented the strategy that was developed. With respect to Mexico, as I think I mentioned earlier, there's actually a delegation here today, quite high-ranking. I'll meet with them this afternoon after we get back to the headquarters, how we can further our work together, noting again steps that Mexican leaders have taken to develop a comprehensive approach under their current president and to begin building the institutions needed to implement it. But again, that's going to take a good bit more of a lot of hard work ultimately to develop the kinds of forces, judicial structures, corrections facilities, and all the rest to be able to implement what is needed there.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that there's a war going on in Mexico. More people have been lost in Mexico in the last number of years than we lost in the Vietnam War. And it's right on our southern border, and it's coming across. So I appreciate your attention to that problem.
Thank you, Mr. Calvert. I have a couple areas I want to try to cover, and some of it is I'm trying to understand exactly where we are, policy-wise, at least from the United States government in relation to our intelligence responsibilities. And I think I'll start with the reconciliation process and just some things I think we need to understand. Is the Haqqani Network, how would you describe the Haqqani Network, Director? Give me 2 sentences on its activities that give us pause for concern.
Well, the Haqqani Network, which is affiliated with the Taliban, but probably not an organization that is likely to reconcile, based, of course, primarily in North Waziristan and the tribal areas of Pakistan, and a very lethal organization that has been behind a number of the most important attacks, the attempted attack on the base, for example, in Wardak province just south of Kabul. They were implicated in attacks on a number of our bases and, of course, on the embassy attack effort as well.
And they've also expressed some interest in reaching outside of that theater as well, have they not?
That's correct. There have been, over the years, indications that they would like to be a bit more transnational. I'm not sure that we can say that we've seen examples of that yet. They're still pretty focused on trying to regain influence over the provinces in which they had historic control during the Taliban time.
So that you could at least say it's aspirational.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, the Taliban has also, over time, expressed some desire to go beyond their theater of operations, and it seems to me that seems to be aspirational as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
The Taliban continues today to have some relationship with AQ, some logistics, finances, recruiting, sharing bases, sharing training, those kinds of things. Is that correct?
That's correct. And indeed, as we've discussed before, Chairman, there's really a syndicate of extremist elements located in some of these sanctuary areas. And particularly in the Waziristans, you'll find not only the Haqqani Network, but also some Afghan Taliban, some Pakistani Taliban, Commander Nazir Group, some al-Qaeda elements, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, among others.
And some of that is, there's a strong relationship through the Quetta Shura as well, is there not?
The Quetta Shura, the overarching Taliban structure, certainly does encompass a number of those, but not all. And again, al-Qaeda would not be necessarily viewed as part of that, although there is a relationship. The Haqqani Network calls themselves Taliban, but again, will respond sometimes to central direction, but not always.
The Taliban uses acts of political assassination to further their gains, do they not?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to cover a few of these quickly.
As do other groups. Again, the Haqqani implicated in these as well, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan up in the northern parts of
So
Afghanistan.
Haqqani also uses political assassination.
Yes, really, all of these organizations.
And they're very lethal. They've been successful to some degree in their attacks.
They have.
Okay. I just want to cover a few of these that just to bring to light. Going into the fall, the Taliban, these are held responsible by the Taliban, were successful in assassinating Chairman Rabbani, who is the chairman of the Afghan High Peace Council and former president of Afghanistan.
Right.
Going into this year, or late last year, excuse me, Musad Khan, the district governor of the Helmand province, who was a successful assassination. El-Haj Bag, the member of the Afghan parliament, and she's been former chief of the police in the Takhar and Kunduz provinces. That was a successful attack and assassination. Razik, the police chief in the Kandahar province, now that one failed, was not successful, but there were some deaths and casualties associated with it. Going into this year, Agha, the district governor in Kandahar province, was assassinated by the Taliban. Mohammed Mama, the prominent anti-Taliban tribal leader in Kandahar, was successfully assassinated by the Taliban. The UN reports that 462 civilians were assassinated by the Taliban in 2010 alone. And so you would argue by these numbers that the Taliban has not abandoned its practice of political assassination as a form of intimidation in Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Certainly.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we see in reports coming out of Afghanistan is the one thing that the Taliban has been telling Afghans is, in fact, we're coming back. The United States is leaving. We're coming back. Matter of fact, we've got some great CIA analysts walk us through that not all that long ago. So that's a disturbing trend, don't you think?
It is, certainly.
Yeah. And so you can see where maybe someone who looks at all of this information might scratch our head and wonder, given the fact that after the negotiations started, they were committing acts of political assassination to undermine all of the work, all of the sacrifice of the United States military and intelligence forces on the ground, why some of us might get a little bit cranky about what we're doing when we talk about reconciliation and the fact, and you can clarify for this, we've already stated in the Senate hearing that the individuals who were discussed as a possible transfer to, as they call it, the confidence building of the I guess what they hope is our peace negotiations, were all deemed too dangerous to release. So we've established that. Is that correct? By a report? My understanding is it was an agency report.
Well, most recently, the agency was asked to assess these 5 individuals, their significance, and the risks that could be incurred by their release, not to the Afghanistan-Pakistan area, but to a third country, with a varying degree of mitigating measures. And indeed, obviously, the risk is higher if you have fewer mitigating measures and lower if you have more of them, and that was what the agency provided.
Sure. But at one point there is a report that says that they're too dangerous to release.
That is, I think, a couple of years ago. Director Clapper, I think, that's an intelligence community report, I think.
Well, I think that's an extrapolation of the determinations that were made by the interagency group on those who would be retained or not from Guantanamo. I don't think that was the exact language used, but in essence, that was the recommendation of the interagency that they be retained at Guantanamo.
Okay.
I have to say, I understand your concern with all this, but whether or not we negotiate and with whom we negotiate and the terms of a negotiation is not an intelligence community call. That's a policy issue.
No, I understand that, Director. However, the intelligence that I hope that the National Security Council is having access to, and I imagine that they're getting access to the same information we are. Is that correct?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Now, this is important because I want to just make sure that we all understand what information we see and what information they see, and why I think from a policy perspective, which is at the end of the day why we're engaged in this whole debate, it's important to have this discussion. I happen to believe this is, if this happens, we have crossed a red line that we will never be able to get back. It is a serious doctrinal change for the United States government. I, Mike Rogers, believe, as a member of this committee, seeing the information that we collect tracks very well of why this is a bad idea. I just want to make sure that they're seeing what we're seeing so that we can come to the conclusion together, and why I think there was so much bipartisan opposition to this during the the NSC's consultation, if you will, with Congress. So I'm just trying to establish basically what we're all looking at so that we can all determine from a policy perspective if this is a good or not a good idea for the national security of the United States. So I understand your aversion to the policy debate, but unfortunately you fuel the information that policymakers are going to use to make this decision. So I'm just trying to set the record.
Yes, sir, understand and would make clear that the intelligence community writ large has been a part of these deliberations in the interagency. And, of course, I don't think anyone harbors any illusions, certainly not in the administration, about whether this and there has not been a final decision made on this, whether this will pan out or not. But it seemed, from the administration point of view, worth exploring.
No, I understand, and I'll just take exception to one comment there, Director. And this is certainly, I'm not being critical, but there have been operational things that have been conducted up to this point. So this isn't an aspirational policy change. This is something that is well underway and has been, at least the suggestion, has been passed along to the very people that we would like to negotiate with. That's very different than we haven't really made any decisions. It's not really done yet. I'll take exception on that one point. I just think this is so serious that we get this piece right. And what our concern was, and I think Mr. Thornberry brought up, and we went and pulled the quote just to make sure we had it right. It said from the Secretary, by mid-part of 2013, we'll be able to make a transition from a combat role to a training advising role. I can't find anyone here that believed that was the timeline of which we are on, both from the Armed Services Committee, the HAC-D on appropriations, and certainly the Intelligence Committee. That was never our understanding. So that is, in fact, a change, because if you're going to make it by mid-2013, even by the Director's assumption of timelines, you have to start that earlier. So I guess why I'm confused by all this is because the rhetoric of which we are pursuing this doesn't match the intelligence of which we are receiving. We've just clarified that they are, in fact, still using political assassination. We have clarified by our intelligence sources, that the Taliban is, in fact, looking at this is triumphant. They know what their timeline is when they have to survive. That we've seen reports of defections to the Taliban, and it's all about intimidation. That's who we know they are. Are you familiar with I'm going to say 2006, it may have been into 2007, the Pakistani effort, I'm going to call it peace negotiation with some of the tribes and some of the Taliban in the Fatah. Are you familiar with that? I call it a peace accord. It really wasn't an accord necessarily, but are you familiar with that effort?
Well, if you're talking about the effort with the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistani, that's correct. And it was limited to the area of Swat Valley in what used to be known as the Northwest Frontier Province. And obviously, the TTP broke that in short order, and that's why the Pakistani Army then subsequently went in and cleared Swat Valley in the Northwest Frontier Province, something they continue to hold today. And they lost a lot of soldiers in doing that.
And which is important because that negotiation gave them breathing space to both reconstitute, recruit, refinance, retrain. And we just saw that as a matter of fact. And we have seen that with the Taliban over and over and over again. And I'm just, we're frustrated in the sense that we had some very classified, sensitive briefings on this along the way. And again, I commend the administration for that. We thought those conversations were going to remain in a sensitive, classified setting because they were just the opportunity to advise and consult. You can imagine how frustrated we are when we find out it was a little bit further along than that. And certainly a press conference on January 22nd basically alluding to this peace process that I think is very, very dangerous to our national security interests. And I just thought it was important that we get this on the record to know that negotiating with people who are associating with this level of violence is very concerning, given that they haven't even slowed down their political assassinations during the course of those very negotiations. Very, very disturbing. Again, I hope that the packages of intelligence that we see are at least in the hands of the NSC so that they can make a wise decision, and I would hope listen to the advice and counsel of the bipartisan members of the intelligence community to turn this thing around before I argue it's too late. I just want to talk about Iran quickly. Director Mueller, I've heard several times, I think this is so important, that the operation that the Quds Force tried to conduct here in the United States to politically assassinate, which is a state sponsor of terrorism act, the Saudi ambassador here, and with disregard, by the way, for civilian casualties, U.S. civilian casualties, was buffoonish, amateurish, not well done. But I just want to cover a few facts I think are important. The criminal that they approached in Mexico, would he have passed a criminal vetting, if you will, of being a pretty good bad guy to be able to move weapons, people, and conduct operations across the border in the United States?
It's hard to definitively say, but certainly he had the wherewithal, if not himself, to contact others who would have that ability.
Yeah, and so there's been some knock that the way they transferred the money was a bit ridiculous. Can you talk about that? Those accounts were because the FBI was early engaged in this operation, which was by a bit of stroke of luck, was it not?
It was. We had the source that had been handled by the DEA and brought it initially to our attention.
And so you can imagine that source is surprised when an Iranian operative shows up and says, gee, I got a deal for you, right? But that's a DEA source. That's not the kind of information they would normally take. Is that correct?
Well, it may not be. I think all of us now take whatever information we can, whether it be DEA, FBI, and get it in the right pew. But they did absolutely the right thing, understood the importance of this, and we then immediately followed up, including carrying the investigation all through to the point in time where the money was provided for the plot to go ahead.
Yeah. And I misstated my question. I just meant that we were fortunate that the DEA had gotten to this guy on another matter, showed up, and the DEA was exceptionally on the ball and turned it over to the FBI quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
I might add, if I could, going back to the discussion was had before on this particular issue, is this certainly was a viable plot, and it also is representative of the willingness to utilize proxies or others to carry out attacks, which, as I think Director Petraeus pointed out, was a modus operandi of Iran.
And Director Clapper, doesn't this get to your point during the Senate testimony that the Iranians have made a calculation that they could possibly pull off an attack in the United States and might have some capability to do that?
Well, obviously they think they do, and that is it's something we need to be vigilant about, given the aggressiveness and incredible boldness in such an audacious plot. So obviously, which they had intended to effectuate here in this city. So we have to be, vigilant for more of that.
And that's not the only act that we have seen globally. They have reached out in other places of the world and done something similar, maybe not the exact MO, but they've done something similar, have they not?
Well, there have been other instances of outreach through proxies and attempts to plots. The one in Thailand is a case in point.
So one of the things that we saw in reporting is Iran's strategic shift to Iraq. They believe with the drawdown that there's some opportunity for them in Iraq. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'll start. Yes, they do. I mean, they see this, our departure from Iraq as